When my mother died on a gray Tuesday morning in March, I was 400 miles away in Seattle, reviewing contracts for a case I'd never finish. The call came from Sunrise Memory Care at 6:47 a.m., a nurse with a practiced, gentle voice telling me that Margaret Chen had passed peacefully in her sleep. Peacefully, as if the last 3 years of Alzheimer's had been peaceful, as if watching my brilliant mother, a woman who spoke 4 languages and built a successful import business from nothing, forget her own name had been anything approaching peace. I was on the road. By 8 a.m., my wife Sarah canceling her hospital shifts to come with me. The 5-hour drive to Spokane felt both too long and not long enough. Too long because grief was eating me alive in that confined space. Not long enough because I wasn't ready to face what waited at the end of this highway. Or rather, who waited? Richard Morrison, my stepfather for 8 years. The man my mother had married at 62, after 15 lonely years as a widow following my father's death. The man who'd seemed so attentive, so caring, so perfect for a woman who deserved happiness in her golden years. The man I was about to discover had stolen everything, but I didn't know that yet as I pulled into the Sunrise Memory Care parking lot at 1:30 p.m. All I knew was that my mother was gone, and the house she'd worked 40 years to buy was somehow, impossibly, no longer mine. Richard was waiting in the lobby, looking appropriately grief-stricken in an expensive black suit I didn't recognize. At 70, he maintained the distinguished silver-haired look that had probably attracted my mother. Tall, fit, the kind of aging handsomeness that came from a lifetime of privilege and good dental work. "David," he extended his hand with practiced solemnity. "I'm so sorry you had to hear the news over the phone. I wanted to call you myself, but the staff insisted on protocol." I shook his hand automatically, noting the Rolex I'd never seen before. Grief does strange things to observation. You notice details that don't matter while the enormous weight of loss crushes everything else. "Can I see her?" My voice came out steady, which surprised me. "Of course. She's in her room. They've made her comfortable." He placed a hand on my shoulder, guiding me down the familiar hallway I'd walked every Sunday for 3 years. "David, we should talk afterward. About arrangements. About the estate." The estate? My mother's collection of belongings that represented 70 years of life. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. My mother lay in her narrow bed looking smaller than I remembered, as if death had diminished her physically in those few hours since I'd seen her last Sunday. Her face was peaceful. Truly peaceful now. Not the confused anxiety that had marked her final years. I sat beside her and took her cold hand, and that's when the tears finally came. Not dramatic sobbing, just silent streams running down my face while Sarah stood behind me with her hands on my shoulders. "I'm sorry I wasn't here," I whispered to the shell of the woman who'd raised me alone after Dad died. "I'm sorry for so many things." We sat there for 20 minutes, maybe 30. Time felt elastic, meaningless. Eventually, Sarah gently squeezed my shoulders. "David, we should let her rest." I kissed my mother's forehead one last time, feeling the unnatural coolness of her skin, and stood. Richard was waiting in the hallway, along with a woman in a business suit I didn't recognize. "David, this is Patricia Kendall. She's the director of Sunrise." Richard's voice carried that smooth tone of someone accustomed to managing situations. "Patricia, this is Margaret's son." "Mr. Chen, I'm so deeply sorry for your loss." Patricia shook my hand with professional sympathy. "Your mother was a wonderful woman. The entire staff loved her." "Thank you." I managed the automatic response while my brain struggled to engage with logistics I wasn't prepared for. "What happens now?" "Well, Mr. Morrison has been handling all of your mother's affairs for the past few years, so he'll be coordinating with the funeral home and—" "Wait." I looked at Richard. What do you mean, handling all her affairs? Richard's expression shifted into something patient and slightly condescending, like I was a child who needed a complicated concept explained slowly. David, your mother appointed me as her power of attorney 3 years ago, when she was first diagnosed. It made sense. I was here in Spokane. You were in Seattle building your career. She wanted to make things easier for everyone. 3 years ago, right when the Alzheimer's diagnosis came, right when my mother was starting to lose her grip on reality, forgetting conversations we'd had an hour earlier, asking the same questions over and over. I didn't know about that. She wanted to handle it privately. Richard's voice carried a hint of reproach. You know how independent Margaret was. She didn't want to burden you. Something cold settled in my stomach, but grief was still too overwhelming to let me examine it properly. I nodded, accepting his explanation because I was too exhausted to question it. The funeral, Sarah interjected gently. We should discuss arrangements. Already handled. Richard smiled, and there was something in that smile. Triumph, maybe, or satisfaction, that should have warned me. Margaret pre-planned everything 2 years ago. Valley View Gardens, cremation, a small service, very tasteful, very her. The funeral home will contact you about the memorial service, Saturday at 2 p.m. Saturday. That's 4 days away. The cremation needs to happen first, and we need time to notify people, arrange flowers, prepare the program. He said it like I was being unreasonable for wanting my mother's funeral to happen faster. It's all standard procedure, David. I let it go. I let all of it go because I was drowning in grief, and he sounded so certain, so in control, so much like he knew what he was doing. That was my first mistake. We checked into a hotel near the funeral home, and I spent the next 3 days in a fog of grief and phone calls, notifying my mother's friends, the ones I knew about at least, calling my own colleagues to explain why I'd be out of the office for a week, writing an obituary that felt inadequate no matter how many times I revised it. Richard handled everything else with smooth efficiency. The service, the flowers, the program with my mother's photo from better days, before the disease stole her mind. He was everywhere, orchestrating, managing, playing the grieving widower with perfect pitch. The funeral on Saturday was exactly what he'd promised. Tasteful, dignified, and surprisingly small. Maybe 30 people in a chapel built for 200. My mother's business partners from her importing days. A few neighbors from the old house on Maple Street. Some staff from Sunrise Memory Care, and Richard's friends. I noticed them clustered together near the back. Well-dressed older couples who murmured condolences to Richard but barely acknowledged me. His social circle, not my mother's. I gave a eulogy that I barely remember. Sarah told me later it was beautiful, that I'd captured my mother's strength and grace, but all I remember is standing at that podium, looking at her photograph and thinking how wrong it was that she'd spent her final years not knowing who I was. Afterward, there was the obligatory reception at some restaurant Richard had chosen. Tiny sandwiches and sympathy. I shook hands with strangers who told me what a wonderful woman my mother was, how lucky Richard had been to find her, how peaceful she looked at the end. Your stepfather is such a devoted man, one blue-haired woman told me, gripping my hand with surprising strength. He visited Margaret every single day at sunrise, every single day for 3 years. That's true love. Every single day. I'd driven from Seattle every Sunday without fail, a 5-hour trip each way. But Richard lived 15 minutes from Sunrise. His daily visits suddenly seemed less impressive and more convenient. The cold feeling in my stomach grew colder. As the reception wound down, Richard pulled me aside to a quiet corner of the restaurant. David, we need to discuss the estate. I know this is difficult timing, but there are legal requirements, timelines we need to follow. Of course. I set down my untouched coffee. The house on Maple Street. We should probably start clearing it out next week. I can take time off work, come back and... Actually, about the house. Richard's expression shifted into something that might have been sympathy, but felt more like pity. David, I think there's been some misunderstanding. The house isn't part of Margaret's estate. The words didn't make sense. I stared at him, waiting for clarification. What do you mean it's not part of her estate? She owned it outright. My father bought it in 1978. She's lived there for 40 years. She did own it! Richard's voice was so gentle it made my teeth hurt. Past tense. Margaret transferred ownership to me 3 years ago, shortly after we married, for estate planning purposes, to avoid probate complications. The restaurant suddenly felt too hot, too small. She wouldn't do that! I understand this is shocking. He pulled a folded document from his jacket pocket, because of course he'd come prepared. But it's all legal and properly recorded. See? The deed transfer, signed by Margaret, witnessed by her attorney, filed with the county on August 14th, 3 years ago. I took the paper with shaking hands. Legal language swam before my eyes. Margaret Chen Morrison hereby transfers all right, title, and interest in the property, located at 847 Maple Street. My mother's signature at the bottom. Shaky, uncertain, not quite like her usual confident script, but unmistakably there. This was 3 months after her diagnosis, I said slowly. 3 months after she started forgetting things. She was still lucid then, David. She had good days and bad days, you remember. This was done on a good day, with her full consent and understanding. Who was her attorney? I want to talk to them. Bernard Kessler. Unfortunately, Bernard passed away last year. Heart attack. Richard took the document back, refolding it with care. I know this is difficult to accept, but Margaret wanted to make sure I was taken care of. We were married, David. Married couples share assets. This is normal. Nothing about this felt normal. What about the rest? Her bank accounts, her investment portfolio, the business assets. Also transferred to joint ownership shortly after we married, then fully to me after she went into memory care. Again, all perfectly legal. All done with Margaret's consent when she was still capable of making those decisions. My hands had gone numb. She had over $300,000 in retirement savings. The house was worth at least $650,000. The business assets. The business was sold 6 years ago. Before we even met. You know that. Richard's patience was starting to show. Cracks. David, I understand you're grieving, but you're also being irrational. Your mother made her choices. She provided for her husband. That's what married people do. You were married for 8 years and you took everything. Everything she worked 40 years to build. I didn't take anything. His voice hardened. I was her husband. I cared for her when you were busy with your career in Seattle. I visited her every day while you came once a week. I held her hand when she didn't know who I was anymore. Don't you dare suggest I didn't earn the right to her estate. The accusation hit like a physical blow. The guilt I'd been carrying for 3 years. The knowledge that I'd let my career, my life in Seattle, keep me from being there more. Suddenly weaponized against me. That's not fair. Life isn't fair, David, but the law is clear. Everything was transferred legally properly with your mother's consent when she was still competent to give it. If you want to contest it, you're welcome to hire a lawyer and try, but I promise you, you'll lose. And you'll spend a fortune in legal fees learning what I'm telling you for free right now. You have no claim to Margaret's estate. He stood up, adjusting his expensive jacket. Bought with my mother's money. I realized with sudden clarity. Everything he was wearing, everything he owned, funded by the woman who died alone in a memory care facility, while her mind dissolved into fog. The memorial service was lovely, Richard said with false warmth. Margaret would have appreciated it. I'll send you a copy of the final bills. Her share of the costs, Comes to about $4,000. I assume you'll want to contribute to your own mother's funeral expenses." He walked away before I could respond, leaving me sitting in that corner of a restaurant I'd never remember the name of, holding a coffee that had gone cold, understanding, with perfect clarity, that I'd just been robbed, and, worse, that it was all completely legal. Sarah drove us back to Seattle that night because I was in no condition to be behind a wheel. I sat in the passenger seat staring at nothing, my mind running the same loop over and over. The house, the savings, the investments, everything. Gone. "We'll fight this," Sarah said into the silence somewhere near the Oregon border. "I know you're exhausted. But David, this isn't right. Your mother wouldn't have done this if she'd been in her right mind. He has documents, signatures, witnesses. From when she had Alzheimer's. Any lawyer will tell you that's grounds for. She was diagnosed 3 years ago, but she'd been showing symptoms for at least a year before that. Forgetting names, repeating herself, getting confused about dates." I closed my eyes against the headache building behind them. Richard could argue she was still competent when she signed those papers. And Bernard Kessler, the attorney who supposedly witnessed everything, is conveniently dead. Then we get her medical records. We prove she wasn't competent. With what money, Sarah? Do you know what a contested estate case costs? We'd be looking at $50,000, maybe $100,000 in legal fees, against a man who now has access to my mother's entire estate to fund his defense. The car filled with silence again. Sarah was a pediatric nurse. I was a third-year associate at a mid-sized firm. We were doing okay, but we didn't have 6 figures lying around for a legal battle I'd probably lose. "So he just gets away with it?" Her voice was tight with anger. "He marries your mother, waits for her to start losing her mind, tricks her into signing over everything, and just wins." That's exactly what had happened. I could see it so clearly now, the timeline laid out like evidence in a case file. 8 years ago. Richard meets my mother at some charity function, begins courtship 7 years ago. They marry after a 6-month romance. At our age, why wait? 6 years ago. My mother sells her importing business. Time to retire and enjoy life. 4 years ago. First signs of memory problems. 3 years ago. Alzheimer's diagnosis. 3 years ago. 3 months later. House transferred to Richard's name. 3 years ago. 6 months later. Bank accounts and investments moved to joint ownership, then solely to Richard 2 years ago. My mother moves into Sunrise Memory Care. She needs professional help. 2 years ago. To now Richard visits daily, maintains. Appearance of devoted husband, waits. This Tuesday. My mother dies and Richard inherits everything. He planned this, I said out loud, the words tasting like poison. From the beginning, he targeted her. A widow, financially stable, getting older. He knew what he was doing. Then prove it. How? Everything was legal. Everything was documented. He was smart enough to do it right. Sarah's hands tightened on the steering wheel. David Chen, I have watched you build cases out of nothing. I've seen you find angles nobody else could see. Connections that seemed impossible. Don't tell me there's nothing you can do. She was right. I was a lawyer, not a corporate attorney or an estate specialist, but I understood the law. I understood research, investigation, building a case from fragments of evidence, and more importantly, I understood revenge. I need to think, I said quietly. I need to see what he's done, every detail, the timeline, the documents, everything. We'll start Monday. Request copies of everything from the county recorder's office, her bank statements, medical records. No! The plan was already forming, cold and clear in my mind. I start tomorrow, because if Richard Morrison thought he could steal my mother's life's work and walk away clean, he's about to learn what happens when you rob a lawyer's family. Sarah glanced at me, and something in my expression made her nod slowly. "Okay," she said. "Okay, tell me what you need me to do." I stared out at the dark highway, watching mile markers flash past in the headlights, and began planning the most important case of my career. The case against the man who'd stolen everything from my mother. And by the time I was done, Richard Morrison would wish he'd never heard the name Margaret Chen. Sunday morning, I was sitting at my desk in our home office in Seattle with 3 legal pads, 2 laptops, and a determination that felt like cold fire in my chest. Sarah brought me coffee at 7 a.m. and found me already deep into public records databases. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked, setting the mug beside a growing pile of printed documents. 3 hours, maybe 4. I didn't look up from the screen. "Sarah, look at this." She leaned over my shoulder to read the marriage license I'd pulled from Spokane County records. Richard Morrison and Margaret Chen, married August 3rd, 7 years ago. We knew that. Look at the address he listed. 2847 Riverside Avenue, apartment 301. Okay, now, look at this. I pulled up another document. A property record from 4 years earlier. Richard Morrison, owner of 2847 Riverside Avenue, apartment 301. Sold December 18th, 9 years ago, for $340,000. Sarah frowned. So he sold his condo and then listed it as his address 2 years later when he married your mother. He didn't own it anymore, which means he was renting, or he lied on the marriage license. I switched screens. But here's what's interesting. I can't find any other property records for Richard Morrison in Spokane County. No house purchases, no other condos. Nothing between selling that apartment and moving into my mother's house. Maybe he was renting somewhere. Maybe. I made a note on my legal pad. Or maybe he had a reason to obscure where he was actually living. Let's look at his employment history. That's where things got interesting. Richard had listed his occupation on the marriage license as financial consultant. Professional, vague, respectable. But when I searched for Richard Morrison Financial Consultant Spokane, I found nothing. No business license, no LLC registration, no website, no LinkedIn profile. For a man who supposedly worked in finance, Richard Morrison had almost no digital footprint from before his marriage to my mother. That's weird, right? Sarah was reading over my shoulder now, her nurse's shift not starting until 3 p.m. Everyone has some kind of online presence. Not if they're trying to hide something. I opened a new search window. Let's try a different angle. Death records and obituaries for Spokane County. Last 15 years female, over 60. David. There could be hundreds. Filter for widows, with estates over $500,000. The search narrowed. Still dozens of results, but manageable. I started reading obituaries looking for patterns, and that's when I found her. Helen Patterson died 11 years ago, at age 68. Beloved wife of the late Robert Patterson, survived by her sister and 2 nephews. I clicked through to the full obituary from the Spokane Review. She was a retired bank executive, active in charity work, enjoyed traveling and gardening. Okay? Sarah sounded puzzled. Look at the comments section. Someone named Richard M. posted, "Helen was a wonderful woman who brought light to everyone she met. I was blessed to know her. She will be deeply missed." That could be anyone. Could be. I was already searching property records. But Helen Patterson owned a house at 1523 Birch Lane, purchased in 1979, sold 13 years ago for $580,000 to Richard Morrison. The room went quiet except for the hum of my laptop. He bought her house. Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. 13 years ago. 2 years before she died. I was typing faster now, pulling up more records. And look, the property was sold again, just 6 months after Helen's death. Richard Morrison sold 1523 Birch Lane for $620,000. Made a $40,000 profit on a house he owned for less than 3 years. Maybe he was her financial consultant. Maybe she sold it to him as part of estate planning. Or maybe he did to Helen Patterson exactly what he did to my mother. The pieces were falling into place like a prosecutor's dream. Find a wealthy widow, get close to her, acquire her assets before she dies. Sarah pulled up a chair beside me. We need more than one case to prove a pattern. We need more than one case to prove a pattern, I agreed. So let's find them. By Sunday evening, we had 3 more. Dorothy Simmons died 9 years ago at 71. Widowed, no children. Estate included a house valued at $435,000 and investment accounts worth approximately $200,000 based on her tax records. Public information for estates over $150,000. In the 2 years before her death, Dorothy had transferred ownership of her house to a dear friend, unnamed in the public records. But the property deed showed the transfer went to Richard A. Morrison. The house was sold 4 months after Dorothy's death. Patricia Mendoza died 7 years ago at 66. Widowed, one estranged daughter in California who contested the will. Court records showed Patricia had changed her will 6 months before her death, leaving everything to Richard Morrison, described in legal documents as a close companion and trusted advisor. The daughter's lawsuit alleged undue influence and diminished capacity. Patricia had early-stage dementia. The case was settled out of court for an undisclosed sum, with Richard keeping the bulk of the estate, including Patricia's house, sold within a year, and her late husband's life insurance payout of $150,000. Evelyn Hart died 5 years ago, at 69. Widowed, 2 sons who apparently didn't contest anything. Her obituary mentioned Richard Morrison by name as a devoted friend who brought joy to Evelyn's final years. Property records showed Evelyn's house transferred to Richard 2 years before her death. Bank records, accessible because the estate went through probate, showed regular withdrawals from Evelyn's accounts in the 2 years preceding her death. $2,000 here, $5,000 there, adding up to nearly $80,000 that couldn't be accounted for in the estate inventory. 4 women, 4 wealthy widows, 4 estates that Richard Morrison had profited from in the span of 13 years. And then my mother, number 5. This is a pattern, Sarah said, staring at the timeline I'd sketched out on my legal pad. This is systematic predation. Yes. I sat back in my chair, my eyes burning from hours of screen time. But proving it in court is different from knowing it happened. He was smart. He married my mother, which gives him legal rights as a spouse. The others, he positioned himself as a friend, a companion, a trusted advisor. Nothing overtly illegal. The daughter who sued, Patricia Mendoza's daughter. Did you get her name from the court records? I checked my notes. Carmen Mendoza-Wright. Last known address in San Diego. We should talk to her. And the sons from Evelyn Hart's family. See what they know. And say what? Hi. I think the man who was close to your deceased mother is a con artist. Want to help me prove it? They settled with him, Sarah. They took money to go away. They're not going to help us reopen old wounds. Sarah stood up and started pacing, her thinking mode. Okay, different angle. You said Patricia's case alleged diminished capacity. There must have been medical records, expert testimony, something that proved she wasn't mentally competent when she changed her will. The case settled. All that evidence is probably sealed as part of the settlement agreement. Probably. But not definitely. She turned to face me. David, you're a lawyer. You know how to unseal records, how to argue for disclosure in the interest of justice. She was right. If I could prove that Richard Morrison had a history of exploiting women with dementia, with Alzheimer's, with diminished mental capacity, it would establish a pattern. It would transform my mother's case from grieving son disputes legal estate transfer into serial predator targets vulnerable women. But it would take time, weeks, maybe months of legal maneuvering. Filing motions, attending hearings, arguing before judges who had no obligation to help me. And in the meantime, Richard Morrison would be living in my mother's house, spending my mother's money, free and clear, unless I could find another way. Monday morning, I called in sick to work, the first time I'd done that in 3 years. Then I drove back to Spokane, alone this time. Sarah had to work her shifts at the hospital, and what I was about to do didn't require backup. It required reconnaissance. Richard's daily routine, according to the blue-haired woman at the funeral, included visiting my mother at Sunrise Memory Care every single day. But my mother was gone now, so where was Richard spending his time? I found out at 10:30 a.m. when I parked across the street from my mother's house. No, Richard's house now. And watched him emerge in tennis whites carrying an expensive racket I didn't recognize. He loaded it into a silver Mercedes, also new, also purchased with my mother's money, and drove off toward the Spokane Country Club. Of course, Richard Morrison, the grieving widower, taking solace in athletic pursuits while his wife of 8 years was barely cold. I waited 10 minutes to be safe, then approached the house I'd grown up in. The key my mother had given me 15 years ago still worked. Richard hadn't changed the locks. Why would he? He had nothing to hide, nothing to fear from the son who'd been successfully frozen out of his own inheritance. Stepping into that house felt like stepping into a museum of my childhood, except everything was slightly wrong. New furniture in the living room, leather and chrome, nothing like my mother's taste for comfortable, lived-in pieces. The walls had been repainted from the warm cream she'd loved to a cold gray. Family photos were gone from the mantel, replaced by abstract art that probably cost thousands. In the kitchen, I found the KitchenAid mixer my mother had used for 20 years, shoved to the back of a cabinet, replaced by some Italian espresso machine that looked like it belonged in a commercial cafe. Every room told the same story. Margaret Chen erased, Richard Morrison installed. I found what I was looking for in the study. My father's old office that my mother had kept as a shrine to his memory, now converted into Richard's personal workspace. A large desk, new, expensive, a filing cabinet, new, locked, and a bookshelf filled with financial planning books and photo albums. The photo albums made my hands shake. 5 of them, leather-bound, identical. I pulled the first one down and opened it. Helen Patterson smiled at me from a dozen photos. Helen at a restaurant with Richard. Helen and Richard at some charity gala. Helen in her garden with Richard standing beside her, his arm around her shoulders. The dates on the photos spanned 2 years, right up until a few months before her death. The second album, Dorothy Simmons. Same pattern. Photos of her and Richard at the theater, at dinner parties, on what looked like a cruise. A 2-year documented relationship. Third album, Patricia Mendoza. Fourth, Evelyn Hart. And the 5th album, the newest one, was my mother. Margaret and Richard at their wedding. Margaret and Richard on vacation in Hawaii. Margaret and Richard at Christmas. Her eyes already showing that distant confusion that would eventually consume her entirely. 5 albums, 5 relationships. 5 dead women and 1 living predator who documented his conquests like a hunter mounting trophies. I pulled out my phone and started photographing every page, every date, every location, every smile from women who'd trusted the wrong man. The camera shutter sound seemed obscenely loud in the quiet house, but I didn't stop until I'd captured every single image. Then I moved to the filing cabinet. It was locked, but I'd been picking locks since I was 12, a skill I'd learned from a misspent youth that was about to prove incredibly useful. 2 minutes with a paperclip from the desk, and the drawer slid open. Inside, a treasure trove of evidence, file folders labeled with names: Helen, Dorothy, Patricia, Evelyn, Margaret. Each folder contained the same items: copies of property deeds, bank account transfers, will changes, power of attorney documents, a systematic record of asset acquisition, organized and maintained like a business filing system, because that's what this was. Richard Morrison's business. Finding wealthy widows, earning their trust, acquiring their assets, waiting for death. My mother's folder was the thickest. 8 years of documentation, the marriage certificate, the property deed transfer dated 3 months after her Alzheimer's diagnosis, August 14th, 3 years ago, just like Richard had said. But clipped to it was something else. A note in Richard's handwriting. M showing increased confusion. Dr. Patterson confirms cognitive decline accelerating. Optimal window for legal transfers closing. Moved timeline up from December to August. BK. Agreed to witness despite concerns about capacity. Assured him she had lucid moments and this was protecting her interests. BK. Bernard Kessler, the conveniently dead attorney. The note was dated August 10th. 4 days before, my mother signed away our house. My hands were steady as I photographed every page of every file. Years of legal training kept me methodical, organized, even as rage burned through my chest like acid. Richard Morrison hadn't just stolen my mother's estate. He'd documented the whole thing. He'd kept records like a professional criminal, confident that his system was foolproof, that he'd never be caught. He'd made one critical mistake, assuming that I'd be like the others, that I'd accept the settlement, take what little I could get, go away quietly, like Patricia Mendoza's daughter and Evelyn Hart's sons. But I wasn't like the others. I was a lawyer who specialized in building cases from circumstantial evidence, and Richard Morrison had just handed me a prosecution file that would destroy him. I was back in my car by 11:45 a.m., memory card full of photos, hands shaking from adrenaline. I called Sarah from a gas station on the outskirts of Spokane. "I have everything," I said when she answered. Photos, documents, notes in his own handwriting. Sarah. He kept files on all of them, all 5 women, like he was running a business. Oh my God. Her voice was tight. "David, that's evidence of fraud, of elder abuse, of crimes that happened years ago, most of them past the statute of limitations." I closed my eyes, forcing myself to think like a lawyer instead of a grieving son. Helen Patterson died 11 years ago. Dorothy Simmons 9 years ago. Even if we could prove he defrauded them, the criminal statutes have run out. What about your mother? That just happened. 3 years ago when he got the property transfers. Fraud has a 3-year statute in Washington for civil cases, longer for criminal. We might be right at the edge of the window, but I trailed off, thinking through the complications. But what? But proving it means proving my mother wasn't competent when she signed those documents. Which means admitting publicly that my mother had Alzheimer's, that her mind was gone, that she spent her final years not knowing who I was. The words caught in my throat. It means putting her illness on trial. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Would she want you to let him get away with it? No. My mother had been a fighter her entire life. Immigrant from Taiwan, who built a successful business through sheer determination. She'd raised me alone after Dad died, working 2 jobs to keep me in good schools. She'd taught me that principles mattered more than convenience, that you stood up to bullies even when it was hard. She wouldn't want me to let Richard Morrison walk away with everything she'd built. "I need to talk to the others," I said, decision made. Carmen Mendoza-Wright, Evelyn Hart's sons. They need to know what Richard did to their mothers. They need to see these files. And if they don't want to reopen it, if they tell you to leave them alone, then I do this alone. But Sarah, if we can get even one of them to join a civil case, to challenge their settlement, it establishes pattern and practice. It transforms this from one isolated incident into systematic elder abuse. How long will that take? I looked at my watch. Monday, 12 p.m. I can be in San Diego by tomorrow morning if I drive through the night. Carmen Mendoza-Wright first. Her lawsuit was the most detailed. She fought the hardest. If anyone will help us, it's her. David, you haven't slept in 2 days. You're not driving to California tonight. Then I'll fly. First flight out of Spokane to San Diego. I'll be there by dinner time. I was already pulling up airline websites on my phone. I'm not waiting on this, Sarah. Every day Richard Morrison spends in my mother's house, spending my mother's money. is another day he wins. She sighed, but I could hear the understanding in it. She knew me well enough to know that when I locked onto something, I didn't let go. Okay, she said finally. But David, be careful. If Richard finds out you broke into the house, if he knows you have those photos, he won't find out. I was careful. Everything's exactly as I found it. Just be careful. Men like him, men who've been getting away with this for years, they don't stop without a fight. Good, I said, and meant it, because I'm ready for a war. I caught the 3 p.m. flight from Spokane to San Diego, landed at 6 p.m. Pacific time, and was standing outside Carmen Mendoza-Wright's house in La Jolla by 7:30 p.m. It was a nice house, not wealthy, but comfortable. Upper-middle-class neighborhood, well-maintained yards, the kind of place where people raised families and built lives. Through the lit windows, I could see a woman in her early 40s moving around a kitchen, talking to someone out of view. I'd found Carmen through LinkedIn. She was a high school principal, married with 2 teenage kids based on the family photos visible on her public Facebook profile. She'd settled her lawsuit against Richard Morrison 7 years ago for an undisclosed amount, and presumably moved on with her life. Now I was about to rip open that old wound. I rang the doorbell at 7:45 p.m., after rehearsing my opening lines a dozen times. The woman who answered matched her LinkedIn photo. Carmen Mendoza-Wright. Dark hair pulled back, intelligent eyes that assessed me quickly. "Can I help you?" "Miss Mendoza-Wright. My name is David Chen. I'm an attorney from Seattle, and I need to talk to you about Richard Morrison." Her expression changed instantly. Shock, then anger, then something like fear. She started to close the door. "Please," I said quickly. "My mother just died. Richard was her husband. He took everything from her estate, and I think he did the same thing to your mother. I have evidence. Physical evidence that he's been doing this for over a decade." Carmen's hand froze on the door. "Evidence?" "Photos, documents, files he kept on 5 different women, including your mother and mine. Please, just give me 10 minutes. If you want me to leave after that, I'll go. But I think you deserve to know what he did." She stared at me for a long moment, then glanced back into the house. "Tom, I need to step outside for a minute." A man's voice. "Everything okay?" "Yeah, just work stuff. 10 minutes." She stepped onto the porch and closed the door behind her, arms crossed defensively. "You have 10 minutes. Start talking." I pulled out my phone and opened the photos I'd taken in Richard's study. This is a file cabinet in Richard Morrison's house. Inside are folders for 5 women: Helen Patterson, Dorothy Simmons, your mother Patricia Mendoza, Evelyn Hart, and my mother Margaret Chen. I showed her the photo of her mother's folder. Each folder contains documentation of asset transfers, property deeds, will changes, a complete record of how Richard Morrison systematically acquired their wealth. In your mother's case, I swiped to the next image, showing the will change document. He convinced her to change her will 6 months before she died, leaving him everything despite her dementia diagnosis. Carmen's face had gone pale. "I know all this. This is why I sued him. But did you know he did it to 4 other women? That your mother wasn't an isolated case, but part of a pattern going back at least 13 years. I showed her the other folders, the photo albums, the timeline I'd constructed. With each image, Carmen's expression shifted from defensive to horrified. "Oh my God," she whispered. "He's been doing this for years. More than a decade. 5 women that I've found so far, possibly more I haven't discovered yet." I showed her Richard's handwritten note about my mother. He waits until they start showing cognitive decline, then moves quickly to transfer assets before they're deemed legally incompetent. He befriends them, earns their trust, positions himself as their protector, and then he robs them blind. Carmen sank down onto her porch step, phone still clutched in her hand, showing photos of her dead mother's file. We settled. 7 years ago, we took $75,000 and signed an NDA. I couldn't even tell people what he'd done. That NDA was signed under fraudulent circumstances. If we can prove Richard Morrison engaged in systematic elder abuse, that he deliberately targeted your mother as part of a pattern, the settlement agreement is void. She looked up at me, tears in her eyes. My mother had $380,000 in savings. The house was worth another $200,000. I got $75,000 and a gag order, and he walked away with over $500,000. Same thing he did to my mother. $650,000 house, $300,000 in retirement savings and investments. All transferred to his name while she had Alzheimer's. I sat down on the step beside her. Carmen, I can't bring our mothers back, but I can make sure Richard Morrison pays for what he did. I can make sure he never does this to another family. How? Her voice was broken. I tried. I fought him for 2 years, spent $30,000 on lawyers, and ended up settling for pennies on the dollar because his attorney said we'd never win. My mother signed those documents, David. They were legal. They were legal, but not ethical, and I think I can prove he knew she wasn't competent when he had her sign them. I showed her the note again. He wrote this about my mother. Optimal window for legal transfers closing. He knew he was exploiting her diminished capacity. He documented it. Carmen read the note 3 times, her lips moving silently. Then she looked at me, with something like hope in her eyes. What do you need from me? First, I need you to tell me everything about your mother's case. Every detail you remember, every piece of evidence your lawyers gathered, every argument they made. The case files are sealed as part of the settlement. But your memories aren't. And second, I paused, knowing I was asking something huge. I need you to be willing to challenge the settlement, to join me in a civil case against Richard Morrison for fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy. To stand up in court and tell the world what he did to your mother. She was quiet for a long moment, staring at the photos on my phone. Inside her house, I could hear the sounds of family life. Voices, laughter, the TV playing something cheerful. Her life, the one she'd built after her mother's death and the painful lawsuit. I was asking her to risk that peace, to reopen wounds that had barely healed. If I do this, she said slowly, if I break the NDA and challenge the settlement, he'll come after me. His lawyers will bury me in motions and depositions and... He'll try, I interrupted. But Carmen, I'm a lawyer too, and I'm very, very good at building cases. With what I have, the files, the pattern, the evidence of 5 victims, we can win this. We can destroy him. She stood up, handing me back my phone. I need to think about it. It's a lot. I need to talk to my husband, my kids. We built a life after that lawsuit. I don't know if I can go through it again. I understand. I pulled out my business card, wrote my cell number on the back. But, Carmen, your mother was 66 years old when she died. She had dementia. She was vulnerable and confused, and Richard Morrison exploited that vulnerability to rob her. If we don't stop him, some other daughter is going to be standing where you're standing right now in 5 years, 10 years, wondering why no one stopped him when they had the chance. She took the card, her hand trembling slightly. How long do I have to decide? As long as you need, but I'm filing a lawsuit in Spokane County within 2 weeks, whether you join me or not. If you want to be part of it, call me before then. 2 weeks? She looked shocked. David, cases like this take months to prepare. I don't have months. Every day that passes, Richard Morrison is living in my mother's house, spending my mother's money, planning his next target. I'm not giving him time to hide assets or find another victim. I met her eyes. 2 weeks. That's all the time we have before the statute of limitations becomes an issue for my mother's case. So I'm moving fast, and I'm moving hard, and I'd like to have you with me. But I'll do it alone if I have to. Carmen nodded slowly. I'll call you. One way or the other, I'll call you within a week. That's all I ask. I walked back to my rental car, not sure if I'd just gained an ally or wasted a trip to California. But as I drove away, I saw Carmen still standing on her porch, staring at my business card like it was a lottery ticket that might be worth everything or nothing at all. I flew back to Seattle on Tuesday morning, went straight to my law firm, and requested an immediate meeting with my supervising partner. Marcus Webb was 58, gray-haired, and one of the best litigation attorneys in the Pacific Northwest. He listened to my entire story without interrupting. The funeral, the inheritance theft, the files I'd found, the pattern of elder abuse spanning 13 years. When I finished, he leaned back in his leather chair and studied me, with the kind of intense focus that made junior associates nervous. "You broke into his house," he said finally. "I used a key my mother gave me, to a house she owned, that Richard Morrison now owns legally, through fraud, that you'll have to prove in court." Marcus pulled off his reading glasses, rubbed his eyes. "David, I understand you're grieving. Your mother just died. You feel you've been robbed. I was robbed. 5 women were robbed. But what you're describing is a massive undertaking. A case like this could take years, cost hundreds of thousands in legal fees, and there's no guarantee you'll win." He leaned forward. "And that's if you can even get it to trial. Richard Morrison's attorney will file for summary judgment, argue that all transfers were legal and consensual, and a judge might agree. You could lose before you ever get in front of a jury. So I should just let him get away with it. I'm saying you need to think carefully about the cost-benefit analysis here. You're a third-year associate with a promising career. You have a wife, a mortgage, a future. Pursuing this case could consume your life, drain your savings, and end with you having nothing to show for it except bitterness." I stood up, unable to sit still anymore. "Marcus, this man has been preying on vulnerable women for over a decade. He targets widows with early dementia, earns their trust, convinces them to sign over their assets, then waits for them to die. He's a predator with a system, and no one has stopped him because families like mine settle, or give up, or don't know what he's doing. And you're going to be the one to stop him." "Yes," I turned to face him, "because I have evidence. Physical evidence that proves a pattern, and because I'm not going to be able to live with myself if I don't try." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood up and walked to his window overlooking downtown Seattle. If you do this," he said, without turning around, "you'll need to take a leave of absence. The firm can't have you working on a personal case during billable hours. We'll call it family medical leave. 4 weeks, maybe 6. "I understand. And, David," he turned to look at me, "when you lose, not if, when, because the odds are stacked against you here, don't let it destroy you. Some battles can't be won, no matter how righteous the cause. I'm not going to lose," I said quietly. "Everyone thinks that before trial. That's why we do this job." He walked back to his desk, pulled out a business card. "But if you're determined to go down this road, call this woman, Diana Reeves, criminal defense attorney. She specializes in elder abuse cases. If anyone can help you build a criminal case against Morrison, it's her." I took the card, surprised. "I thought you were trying to talk me out of this." "I am. But I'm also a lawyer. And what you've described is one of the most egregious examples of elder abuse I've heard in 30 years of practice." His expression hardened. "If you're going to war, go prepared. Diana Reeves will tell you whether you have a criminal case. And, David, if you do, I want you to destroy him." I called Diana Reeves from the firm's parking lot. She agreed to meet me that afternoon at a coffee shop in Capitol Hill, neutral territory where we could talk freely. She was not what I expected. Mid-50s, dressed in jeans and a leather jacket, with the kind of direct gaze that suggested she'd seen every type of human garbage and wasn't impressed by any of it. "Marcus says you have evidence of serial elder abuse," she said, not bothering with small talk. Show me. I pulled out my laptop and opened the files of photos I'd taken from Richard's study. She went through them methodically, her expression never changing, occasionally asking questions in a clipped professional tone. 20 minutes later, she closed the laptop and looked at me. This is the most well-documented case of financial elder abuse I've ever seen, outside of an actual prosecution file. The fact that your perpetrator kept records is either stunning arrogance or pathological need to document his conquests. Can we use it for a criminal case? Potentially. She flagged down the barista for a refill of coffee. Here's the problem. You obtained this evidence through what's legally a breaking and entering. Morrison can argue the photos are inadmissible because you violated his Fourth Amendment rights. He stole from my mother, and that doesn't give you legal authority to burglarize his house. I know it's not fair, David, but that's the law. She held up a hand before I could protest. However, there are workarounds. If you were to anonymously tip off the Spokane Police Department about suspected elder abuse, and they were to obtain a search warrant based on the pattern you've identified, anything they find in that house becomes admissible evidence. I felt a surge of hope. Can you help me do that? I can connect you with someone in the SPD Elder Abuse Unit. But David, you need to understand, even with a search warrant, even with all this evidence, criminal prosecution for financial crimes is hard. Prosecutors need to prove intent beyond a reasonable doubt. Morrison's attorney will argue that these women gave him money willingly, that he was their companion and friend, that they wanted to provide for him. He has notes in his own handwriting about exploiting their diminished capacity, which helps. But criminal cases take time, months to investigate, months to charge, months to trial. And that's if the prosecutor even decides to file charges. She leaned forward. Civil cases are faster and have a lower burden of proof. You just need to prove by preponderance of evidence, more likely than not, that Morrison committed fraud. That's much easier than proving it beyond reasonable doubt. But civil cases only recover money. They don't put him in prison. No, Diana agreed. They don't. So the question is, what do you want more? Your mother's money back or Richard Morrison behind bars? I thought about my mother's face in those photos, the confusion in her eyes as Alzheimer's stole her mind. I thought about Helen Patterson and Dorothy Simmons and Patricia Mendoza and Evelyn Hart, 5 women whose families had been violated by the same predator. Both, I said. I want both. I want him in prison, and I want every dollar he stole returned to the families he robbed. Diana smiled for the first time since we'd sat down. Then we do this the smart way. We file a civil case immediately. You've got 2 weeks before statute of limitations becomes an issue. We use discovery in the civil case to build the criminal case. Everything Morrison has to turn over in civil discovery, bank records, property documents, correspondence, becomes ammunition for the criminal prosecution. And the photos I took. We never mention them to the police. You simply tell them about your suspicions based on public records and your mother's experience. Let them discover Morrison's filing cabinet on their own through proper channels. She pulled out her phone, started typing notes. I'll reach out to my contact in SPD tomorrow. You focus on filing your civil complaint. Name Morrison as defendant, allege fraud, undue influence, elder abuse, and conversion of assets. We're going for maximum pressure from day one. What about Carmen Mendoza-Wright, the daughter who sued him before? Bring her in if she's willing. Multiple plaintiffs strengthen the pattern argument. But don't wait for her. File on your own if you have to. Diana looked up from her phone. How much time can you dedicate to this? I'm taking a leave of absence from my firm. 6 weeks, maybe more if I need it. Good, because for the next 6 weeks, building this case becomes your full-time job. We're going to destroy Richard Morrison's life the way he destroyed your mother's. We're going to take everything from him, his money, his freedom, his reputation. And we're going to make sure he never hurts another family again. For the first time since my mother died, I felt something other than grief and rage. I felt hope. I spent the next 5 days doing what I did best, building a case. My home office became war room headquarters. One wall covered with a timeline spanning 13 years. Every woman Richard had targeted, every asset transfer, every death, every dollar stolen. Red strings connected dates to documents to bank transactions like something from a crime drama. Except this was real, and the victims were real, and the predator was still free. Sarah would come home from her nursing shifts at 11 p.m. to find me still working, surrounded by legal pads and coffee cups and printouts of property records. "You need to sleep," she'd say, the same thing every night. "I'll sleep when I file," I'd reply. Also the same thing every night. On Wednesday, Carmen Mendoza-Wright called. "I'm in," she said without preamble. "Tom and I talked about it. My kids are old enough to understand why this matters. And you're right, if we don't stop him, someone else's mother becomes his next victim." Relief flooded through me. "Thank you. I know what you're risking." "I'm risking money and time. He already took my mother. There's nothing left to lose." Her voice hardened. "What do you need from me?" "Everything you remember about your lawsuit. Depositions, evidence, medical records. Anything you kept from the case." I kept everything. After we settled, I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. I think part of me always knew we'd given up too early. She paused. "I have banker's boxes in my garage. Transcripts, medical expert reports, documentation of my mother's cognitive decline. You want me to ship them? I'll come get them. I can be in San Diego by tomorrow afternoon." "That's not necessary." "Carmen, this case goes to filing on Monday. I need to review every piece of evidence by this weekend." I was already booking flights on my laptop. "I'll be there tomorrow at 2 p.m. Have everything ready." She laughed, but it sounded relieved. "You're not messing around. Richard Morrison spent 13 years preying on vulnerable women. I'm not giving him one extra day to hide assets or find victim number 6. Thursday afternoon, I was sitting in Carmen's garage in La Jolla, surrounded by 4 bankers' boxes labeled Mendoza v. Morrison, estate dispute. The treasure inside was better than I'd hoped. Medical records from Patricia Mendoza's neurologist documenting her dementia diagnosis 18 months before her death. Detailed progression notes showing increasing confusion, memory loss, inability to manage her own finances. Deposition transcripts where Richard Morrison claimed he was just a friend helping out, while simultaneously admitting he'd received $150,000 from Patricia's accounts, her house valued at $435,000, and her late husband's life insurance payout. Expert witness reports from a geriatric psychiatrist Carmen had hired, stating unequivocally that Patricia Mendoza lacked capacity to change her will in the 6 months before her death. And the smoking gun, bank records showing systematic withdrawals from Patricia's accounts in the 2 years before her death. $2,000 on March 15th, $5,000 on April 3rd, $3,500 on May 22nd, always in amounts just under $10,000. The threshold that triggers mandatory bank reporting to the IRS. "He was structuring the withdrawals," I said, showing Carmen the pattern, deliberately keeping them under the reporting threshold so no one would notice the systematic bleeding of her accounts. Carmen looked over my shoulder at the highlighted numbers. "My attorney pointed that out during the lawsuit. Morrison's lawyer claimed my mother gave him that money as gifts, that they were documented with gift cards she signed. Did you ever see those gift cards? No. They supposedly existed, but were never produced in discovery. His attorney said they were private documents protected by attorney-client privilege." She laughed bitterly. "We were too exhausted to fight it. After 2 years of legal bills, we just wanted it to be over." I made notes furiously. "Okay, this is good. This is really good. We can use this pattern to show systematic exploitation across all 5 victims." "David?" Carmen's voice was hesitant. What happens if we lose? If we go through all this and a judge decides Morrison did nothing wrong? I looked up from my notes. Then we lose. We'll have spent months in litigation, thousands in legal fees, and Richard Morrison will still be living in my mother's house. That's not very reassuring. It's not supposed to be. This is going to be brutal, Carmen. Morrison will drag your mother's memory through the mud, claim she was happy to give him money, that their relationship was real and loving. He'll make you look like a greedy daughter who couldn't accept that her mother found companionship. I held her gaze. Can you handle that? She was quiet for a moment. Then, my mother was a brilliant woman. She taught high school English for 30 years. She spoke 3 languages. She raised me alone after my father died, worked 2 jobs to put me through college. Her voice broke slightly. At the end, she couldn't remember my name. She'd look at me like I was a stranger, and Richard Morrison used that vulnerability to rob her blind. Yes, he did. Then yes, I can handle whatever his lawyers throw at me. Because my mother deserves justice, even if it comes too late for her to see it. I flew back to Seattle Thursday night with 4 boxes of evidence checked as luggage and a co-plaintiff ready to fight. Friday morning, I met with Diana Reeves at her office downtown. She'd been busy. "Good news," she said as I walked in. I talked to Detective Sarah Yates with Spokane PD's Financial Crimes Unit. She's interested in your case. Very interested. Elder abuse is her specialty, and she's been trying to nail Morrison for years. I nearly dropped my coffee. She knows about him. Not officially. But Spokane's a small community, David. Word gets around when wealthy widows keep dying and leaving everything to the same man. Sarah's had her suspicions, but never enough evidence to get a warrant. Diana pulled up emails on her computer. She wants to meet with you, Monday morning, 9 a.m., at SPD headquarters. Bring everything you have on the pattern of victims, but not the photos I took from his house. I know. Just the public record stuff and Carmen's case files. Exactly. Let her discover the filing cabinet on her own, through proper channels. Diana printed out several documents and handed them to me. These are sample criminal complaints for elder abuse and fraud. Read them tonight. Familiarize yourself with the elements of the crimes. When you meet with Detective Yates, you need to walk her through how Morrison's actions meet every element. I skimmed the documents. This is criminal work. I thought you said we'd lead with civil. We are. Your civil complaint gets filed Monday afternoon, right after your meeting with Yates. Criminal investigation takes months. We need the civil discovery process running in parallel, so we can feed evidence to the criminal case. She pulled up a calendar. Here's the timeline. Monday, 9 a.m., meet with Detective Yates. Monday, 2 p.m., file civil complaint in Spokane County Superior Court. Tuesday, Morrison gets served with the lawsuit. Wednesday, his attorney files a response and we're off to the races. What kind of response should I expect? Motion to dismiss, definitely. He'll argue statute of limitations, claim all transfers were legal and consensual, say you have no standing to challenge transfers your mother made while alive. Diana leaned back in her chair. But here's where Carmen's participation becomes critical. She's challenging her settlement agreement, claiming it was procured through fraud. That transforms this from one disgruntled son into a pattern of predatory behavior. And if the judge grants the motion to dismiss, then we appeal, and we keep fighting until we win or run out of options. She studied me carefully. David, I need you to understand something. Richard Morrison has been doing this successfully for 13 years. He's good at it. He has expensive attorneys who are also good at it. This isn't going to be a quick victory. I don't care how long it takes. You say that now. But 6 months from now, when you've burned through your savings and you're still stuck in discovery disputes, you might feel differently. I won't. I met her gaze steadily. My mother spent 3 years losing her mind piece by piece. I watched her forget my name, forget my father, forget everything that made her who she was. And while she was disappearing into that fog, Richard Morrison was systematically stealing everything she'd worked 40 years to build. So no, Diana, 6 months from now I'll still want to destroy him. A year from now, 2 years from now, however long it takes. She smiled slightly. Good, because that's the kind of commitment this case needs. She handed me a thick folder. Your homework for the weekend. Draft the civil complaint. Use these sample pleadings as templates, but make it specific to your mother's case. Every asset transfer, every date, every dollar. We're going to paint a picture so clear that the judge can't ignore the pattern. I took the folder, already mentally drafting paragraphs. Anything else? Yeah, one more thing. She pulled up a news article on her computer, turned the monitor so I could see it. Recognize her? The woman in the photo was maybe 75, elegantly dressed, smiling at some charity event. The caption read, "Local philanthropist Margaret Whitmore announces $2 million donation to Children's Hospital." Should I? Margaret Whitmore, widow of Thomas Whitmore, founder of Whitmore Industries. Thomas died 3 years ago, left Margaret an estate worth approximately $8 million. Diana highlighted a section of the article. And guess who's been seen escorting Mrs. Whitmore to various social events over the past 6 months? My stomach dropped. Richard Morrison! Richard Morrison! They were photographed together at the Symphony last month, at a gallery opening 2 weeks ago, at this very charity event just 5 days ago. She closed the browser window. David, I think he's already working on victim number 6. The rage that swept through me was cold and clarifying. While I'd been grieving my mother, while I'd been gathering evidence and building a case, Richard Morrison had been courting his next target. We need to warn her, I said immediately. With what? We have no proof he's doing anything illegal. He's allowed to have friends, allowed to attend social events. Diana's expression was grim. But if we can get the criminal investigation moving, if Detective Yates can get a warrant and find that filing cabinet, we might be able to intervene before he convinces Mrs. Whitmore to start signing over assets. And if we can't move fast enough, then Margaret Whitmore becomes another name on his list, and her family spends years trying to recover what he stole. I stood up, folder clutched in my hands. Then I guess I'd better write a really compelling complaint because we're not giving him time to rob anyone else. I spent the entire weekend writing the most detailed civil complaint I'd ever drafted. 37 pages, single-spaced, with exhibits documenting every asset transfer, every suspicious withdrawal, every piece of evidence showing Richard Morrison's pattern of targeting wealthy widows. Complaint for fraud, undue influence, elder abuse, and conversion comes now. Plaintiff David Chen, individually and as successor in interest to the estate of Margaret Chen Morrison, deceased, and plaintiff Carmen Mendoza-Wright, individually and as successor in interest to the estate of Patricia Mendoza, deceased, and allege as follows. I detailed everything. My mother's Alzheimer's diagnosis, the timeline of asset transfers, Richard's handwritten notes about her optimal window closing, the pattern of 5 victims spanning 13 years, Carmen's mother's case and the suspicious settlement. By Sunday night at 11 p.m., it was done. Sarah read it cover to cover while I paced our living room, too wired on caffeine and adrenaline to sit still. "This is devastating," she said finally. "David, if a judge reads this and doesn't grant you relief, there's no justice in the world." "Let's hope there is." I took the printed pages from her, already thinking about tomorrow's meeting with Detective Yates. Because in 12 hours we go public. Richard Morrison's perfect system is about to get torn apart. Monday morning, 9 a.m., I sat in a conference room at Spokane Police Department headquarters with Detective Sarah Yates and Diana Reeves. Detective Yates was younger than I expected. Maybe 40, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that reminded me of my mother in her business days. She listened to my entire presentation, without interrupting, occasionally making notes, her expression giving nothing away. When I finished walking through the timeline of 5 victims, she sat back and looked at me. Mr. Chen, what you're describing is one of the most sophisticated elder abuse schemes I've encountered in 15 years of financial crimes investigation. If even half of what you're alleging is true, Richard Morrison is a serial predator who should be behind bars. It's all true. I can provide documentation for every claim. I believe you. But here's my problem. Most of these crimes happened years ago. Helen Patterson died 11 years ago. Dorothy Simmons 9 years ago. Even Patricia Mendoza's case is 7 years old. She pulled out a legal pad. Washington's statute of limitations for theft and fraud is 3 years. For your mother's case, we're right at the edge. The asset transfers happened 3 years ago next month. If we don't move fast, we lose the ability to charge him criminally. Diana leaned forward. What do you need to move forward with a criminal investigation? Probable cause that a crime was committed. Right now I have David's suspicions and public records showing a pattern that looks suspicious. That's not enough for a warrant. She tapped her pen against the pad. But if I had evidence that Morrison deliberately exploited Margaret Chen's diminished capacity, that he knew she couldn't consent to those transfers, that would give me probable cause. I thought about the filing cabinet in Richard's study, the handwritten notes, the systematic documentation of his crimes. What if I told you I have reason to believe Morrison keeps detailed records of his relationships with these women? Files documenting the asset transfers, notes about their mental capacity, photo albums spanning years. Detective Yates's eyes sharpened. Where would these records be located? In his home. My mother's former home at 847 Maple Street. And you know this how? Diana put a hand on my arm. A warning. I chose my words carefully. Based on Richard Morrison's attention to detail in other aspects of these relationships, and based on the systematic nature of the asset transfers across multiple victims, I believe he would have kept records. Documentation that would help him manage multiple targets simultaneously, ensure he didn't miss any asset transfer opportunities, protect himself legally if questioned. It wasn't a lie. It was an inference based on evidence. The lawyer's way of directing attention without revealing how I actually knew. Detective Yates studied me for a long moment. You didn't answer my question. With respect, Detective, I'm answering it the best way I can without compromising your investigation. What I can tell you is that if you were to obtain a search warrant for 847 Maple Street, specifically looking for documents related to financial relationships with Margaret Chen and the other 4 victims I've identified, I believe you would find evidence of systematic elder abuse. She glanced at Diana, who nodded slightly. Okay, Detective Yates said finally. Here's what I can do. Based on the pattern you've identified, 5 victims, systematic asset transfers, evidence of diminished capacity in at least 2 cases, I can present this to a judge and request a search warrant. If we find what you're suggesting exists, we move forward with criminal charges. How long will that take? Getting the warrant. 2, maybe 3 days if I can get on a judge's calendar quickly. She stood up, gathering her notes. Mr. Chen, I want to be clear about something. Criminal cases move slowly. Even if we find evidence and file charges, it could be months before trial. In the meantime, Morrison will likely try to liquidate assets, flee the jurisdiction, or destroy evidence. That's why we're also filing a civil case today at 2 p.m., Diana interjected. We'll request an immediate restraining order freezing all of Morrison's assets, pending resolution of the fraud claims. That way he can't hide money while both cases are pending. Detective Yates smiled for the first time since the meeting started. I like how you think, counselor. Okay, give me 72 hours. By Thursday, I'll either have a search warrant or I'll tell you we don't have enough for probable cause. Either way, you'll know where we stand. We shook hands and I left the police station feeling like I'd just run a marathon. 1 meeting down, 1 to go. At 2 p.m., I walked into the Spokane County Superior Court Clerk's office and filed Chen v. Morrison, case number 25-2-04891-31. The clerk stamped my complaint with the official court seal, assigned it to Judge Patricia Hendricks's docket, and handed me a copy. "Defendant will need to be served," she said, in the bored tone of someone who'd processed 10,000 lawsuits. "You can arrange that through a private process server or the sheriff's department. I'll handle it today." I'd already hired a process server who was waiting in the parking lot. "How soon before the case gets assigned a hearing date?" "Depends on the judge's calendar and whether defendant files any preliminary motions. Expect at least 30 days before you see the inside of a courtroom." 30 days. An eternity for Richard Morrison to hide assets, destroy evidence, convince Margaret Whitmore to sign over her $8 million estate. I handed the complaint to my process server, a grizzled ex-cop named Frank who specialized in serving defendants who didn't want to be found. "Richard Morrison, 847 Maple Street. Serve him today if possible." Frank glanced at the complaint, whistled at the page count. "Somebody's in trouble. You want me to wait for a response or just serve and go?" "Serve and go. I don't need anything from him right now except confirmation he knows he's being sued." "You got it. I'll call you when it's done." I watched Frank drive away with my lawsuit in his briefcase and felt a savage satisfaction. Richard Morrison had spent 13 years operating in the shadows, preying on vulnerable women who couldn't fight back. As of 2:17 p.m. on Monday afternoon, he was about to discover what it felt like to be the prey instead of the predator. Frank called at 4:47 p.m. "Served." Morrison answered the door at 4:30, signed for the complaint, turned an interesting shade of purple when he saw what it was. Frank chuckled. He said, and I quote, "That ungrateful little shit," then slammed the door in my face. "You really pissed this guy off." "Good." "Did he say anything else?" "Just yelled through the door that his lawyer would destroy you." Standard defendant bluster. I've heard worse. I thanked Frank and ended the call, then immediately dialed Carmen Mendoza-Wright. "It's done," I told her. "Morrison's been served. He knows we're coming for him." "How long before he responds?" "Washington gives defendants 20 days to answer a complaint. But knowing Richard, he'll file something sooner. Probably a motion to dismiss. Try to get the case thrown out before discovery even starts. And if the judge grants the motion, then we appeal and keep fighting." "But, Carmen, judges don't like dismissing cases that allege elder abuse with this much detail. We've documented a pattern spanning 13 years, 5 victims, nearly $2 million in stolen assets. That's not the kind of case a judge throws out on procedural grounds." She was quiet for a moment. "David, I've been thinking about what you said. About Morrison working on another victim. Margaret Whitmore. What about her?" I looked her up. "She's on the board of 3 charities I've worked with through my school. I know people who know her." Carmen paused. "What if I reached out, woman to woman, told her about my mother's case, warned her that Morrison has a history?" I considered it. Morrison's lawyers would claim you're interfering with his relationships, harassing their client. It could backfire. Or it could save her from becoming victim number 6. She was right. We couldn't wait for the legal system to protect Margaret Whitmore while Richard Morrison systematically positioned himself to rob her. "Okay," I said, "but be careful how you approach it. Don't make accusations you can't prove. Just tell her about your mother's experience. Suggest she might want to be cautious about anyone trying to get involved in her financial affairs. I'll reach out tomorrow. The worst she can do is tell me to mind my own business. And, Carmen, thank you for joining this fight, for being brave enough to reopen wounds that barely healed. My mother would have done the same thing. She taught me that standing up to bullies matters more than taking the easy road." I could hear the smile in her voice. "Let's destroy this son of a bitch." Tuesday morning at 9:15 a.m., my phone rang. Unknown number from Spokane area code. "David Chen," I answered. "Mr. Chen, this is James Patterson with Patterson and Associates. I represent Richard Morrison. in the matter of Chen versus Morrison, case number 25-2-04891-31. Richard's attorney. That was fast. What can I do for you, Mr. Patterson? You can withdraw this frivolous lawsuit before you embarrass yourself further. His voice carried the smooth condescension of someone who'd been winning cases while I was still in law school. Your complaint is nothing but the emotional ravings of a grieving son who can't accept that his mother made legal decisions about her own estate. Is there a point to this call, counselor? Or did you just want to hear yourself talk? A pause. The point, Mr. Chen, is that my client is prepared to be generous. He understands your grieving, that you feel you were entitled to your mother's estate, despite her marriage to Richard. He's willing to offer you a settlement, $50,000, no admission of wrongdoing, case dismissed with prejudice. $50,000 out of an estate worth nearly $1 million. Tell your client he can take his settlement offer and, before you make a decision you'll regret, Patterson interrupted smoothly. You should know that we'll be filing a motion to dismiss this afternoon. We'll also be filing a counterclaim for malicious prosecution, abuse of process, and defamation. By the time we're done, you won't just lose your mother's estate. You'll owe my client money for the privilege of having wasted his time. File whatever you want. We'll see you in court, Mr. Chen. I've been practicing law for 23 years. I've seen hundreds of cases like this. Angry relatives who can't accept that mom or dad made choices they don't agree with. You know what they all have in common? Enlighten me. They lose. Every single one of them loses, because the law is very clear. Competent adults have the right to dispose of their property as they see fit. Your mother signed legal documents transferring her assets to her husband. The fact that you don't like it doesn't make it illegal. My mother had Alzheimer's. She wasn't competent to sign those documents. According to whom? You, a grief-stricken son with a financial motive to challenge the transfers? Patterson's voice hardened. We have medical records showing Margaret was lucid and oriented when she signed those documents. We have testimony from Bernard Kessler, may he rest in peace, confirming she understood what she was doing. We have everything we need to prove this was her choice. Bernard Kessler is dead. Convenient. Convenient? He died of a heart attack, Mr. Chen. Are you suggesting my client somehow arranged that? I thought about Richard's note. BK agreed to witness despite concerns about capacity. Bernard Kessler had concerns. He knew Margaret wasn't fully competent, but he witnessed the documents anyway. I'm suggesting your client has a pattern of targeting vulnerable widows, exploiting their diminished capacity and stealing their estates. And I'm going to prove it in court. A pattern, Patterson laughed. You mean the conspiracy theory you've outlined in your complaint? Helen Patterson, Dorothy Simmons, the others. Mr. Chen, those women were my client's friends. He helped them, supported them, and yes, they showed their appreciation through gifts and estate provisions. That's called friendship, not fraud. It's called elder abuse. And when Detective Yates executes her search warrant and finds the filing cabinet where your client documented his crimes, you're going to wish you'd never taken this case. The line went silent for a moment. What filing cabinet? Patterson's voice had changed. Less confident, more careful. The one where Richard Morrison keeps detailed records of his relationships with all 5 victims. Property transfers, bank account information, notes about their mental capacity, photo albums spanning years. The one that's going to prove systematic predatory behavior. You're bluffing, am I? I guess we'll find out when SPD shows up with a warrant, won't we? Another pause. If you've illegally obtained any evidence, Mr. Chen, it will be excluded from trial, and you'll be facing criminal charges yourself. I haven't obtained anything illegally, but I've directed law enforcement to evidence that I believe exists based on my knowledge of your client's methods. What they find is up to them. You're making a mistake. Richard Morrison is not the villain you've imagined him to be. He's a 70-year-old man who lost his wife and is now being attacked by her son for having the audacity to survive her. He's a predator who spent 13 years robbing elderly women with dementia, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows it. Then I'll see you in court, Mr. Chen. And when this is over, when you've lost your case and bankrupted yourself in legal fees, remember that I offered you a way out. He hung up before I could respond. I sat there for a moment, phone still in my hand, replaying the conversation. James Patterson was good, confident, aggressive, the kind of attorney who won cases through intimidation and superior resources. But he'd made one critical error. He'd assumed I was like all the others. The angry relatives who challenged estate transfers and lost because they couldn't prove their case. He didn't understand that I wasn't fighting for money. I was fighting for justice, and I didn't plan to lose. Wednesday afternoon, Diana Reeves called with news. Judge Hendricks granted our temporary restraining order. All of Morrison's assets are frozen pending resolution of the case. Bank accounts, investment portfolios, the house on Maple Street, everything. Relief flooded through me. He can't hide money now? He can't hide, sell, or transfer anything without court approval. We've got him locked down financially. She paused. But David, you need to know. His attorney filed a motion to dismiss this morning. It's well written, cites all the right cases, makes strong arguments about statute of limitations and your mother's right to dispose of her property as she saw fit. When's the hearing? 2 weeks from Friday. Judge Hendricks's standard timeline for hearing dispositive motions. Diana's voice became serious. David, I need you to be prepared for the possibility that we lose this motion. Patterson's arguments are solid. If the judge agrees that your mother was legally competent when she signed those transfers, this case is over before discovery even starts. My mother had Alzheimer's, which was diagnosed 3 years ago. The defense will argue she had good days and bad days, that the transfers happened during a lucid period, that she understood what she was doing. She didn't understand. Richard manipulated her, waited until she was confused enough to be controllable, but not so far gone that the transfers would be obviously invalid. I believe you, but believing something and proving it in court are different things. Diana sighed. We need ammunition for this hearing. Something that definitively shows Morrison knew your mother wasn't competent when she signed those documents. I thought about the handwritten note. Optimal window for legal transfers closing. Richard had written that 4 days before my mother signed away her house. What if I told you I could get you evidence that Morrison documented his knowledge of her declining capacity? Notes in his own handwriting talking about the optimal window for transfers before she became too incompetent. I'd ask how you plan to introduce evidence that you obtained through illegal entry into his house. What if law enforcement found it through a legal search warrant? Then it would be admissible in the criminal case, but not necessarily in our civil case. We'd need independent grounds to request it in discovery. I thought for a moment. What if we subpoena Morrison's personal records in discovery? Request all documents related to his relationship with my mother, all communications about her mental health, all notes or journals documenting their interactions. We can try, but he'll fight it. Attorney-client privilege, privacy concerns, claims that his personal papers aren't relevant to the case. Diana paused. Unless what? Unless the criminal investigation finds that evidence first. If Detective Yates executes her warrant and discovers those notes, they become part of the criminal case file. At that point, we can reference the criminal investigation in our civil case, argue that Morrison's own documentation proves his fraudulent intent. How soon can Yates move? I'll call her this afternoon, see where she is with the warrant. Application. Diana's voice sharpened with something like excitement. David, if we can get that evidence in front of Judge Hendricks before the dismissal hearing, if we can show the judge physical proof that Morrison knew your mother wasn't competent, this case changes completely. Then let's make it happen. We've got 2 weeks before that hearing. 2 weeks to build a case that the judge can't ignore. Thursday morning, Detective Yates called. "Mr. Chen, I've got good news and bad news. Which do you want first?" My stomach clenched. Bad news. Judge Martinez denied my warrant application. He said the pattern you've identified is suspicious, but doesn't establish probable cause that a crime was committed in this specific case. He wants more concrete evidence before he'll authorize a search of Morrison's home. What would constitute concrete evidence? Testimony from a witness who can personally attest to Morrison's knowledge of Margaret's diminished capacity. Medical records proving she was incompetent at the time of the transfers. Direct evidence of fraud rather than circumstantial inference from a pattern. I closed my eyes, fighting frustration. And the good news? The good news is that your lawsuit has gotten Richard Morrison nervous. Very nervous. Yates sounded satisfied. I've been monitoring his activities since our meeting Monday. He's made 3 trips to his bank, 2 visits to his attorney's office, and yesterday he spent 4 hours at a storage facility on the east side of town. Storage facility? Unit 243, Spokane Self-Storage on Sprague Avenue. He rented it 6 months ago, under his name, pays in cash each month. She paused meaningfully. Now, why would a man who just inherited a $650,000 house with plenty of room need a storage unit? To hide evidence, I said slowly. Documents he doesn't want anyone to find. The filing cabinet. That would be my guess. But here's the beautiful part. If Morrison is moving evidence around, if he's attempting to hide or destroy records relevant to your civil case, that's obstruction. That gives me probable cause for a warrant. Can you get surveillance on the storage unit? Already done. I've got an officer watching it 24/7. If Morrison goes back, if he tries to remove anything or destroy evidence, we'll know immediately. Yates's voice hardened. And when he does, I'll have Judge Martinez on speed dial with a warrant application for both the storage unit and his house. Hope flared in my chest. How long before he makes a move? Hard to say. He's spooked but careful. Could be days, could be weeks. She paused. But, Mr. Chen, there's something else you should know. Morrison has been making calls to Margaret Whitmore. Multiple calls per day. Escalating in frequency since your lawsuit was filed. The predator circling his next victim, moving faster now that he knew he was being hunted. Can you warn her? About what? We have no evidence he's doing anything illegal. He's allowed to call his friends. Yates sounded frustrated. But I did have an unofficial conversation with Mrs. Whitmore's estate attorney. Not mentioning Morrison by name, just suggesting that wealthy widows should be cautious about anyone trying to influence their estate planning. Whether that message gets through or not, I can't control. What about Carmen Mendoza-Wright? She knows people who know Whitmore. She's planning to reach out with a warning. That's your call. Personally, I'd encourage it. The more people whispering caution in Mrs. Whitmore's ear, the harder it will be for Morrison to isolate and manipulate her. Yates's voice softened slightly. David, I know this isn't moving as fast as you want, but we're building a case, and when it comes together, it's going to be airtight. I hope so. Because every day Morrison's free is another day some family is at risk. I know. That's why I'm working overtime on this. He's slipped through too many investigations, hurt too many families. This time we get him right. That evening, Carmen called with an update. I reached out to Margaret Whitmore through a mutual friend, someone on the Children's Hospital board we both work with. Asked if I could meet with her to discuss a charitable project. And she agreed to coffee tomorrow afternoon. I'm not going to ambush her with accusations about Morrison. Just share my own mother's story. Mention that she should be cautious about anyone trying to get too involved in her financial affairs. Carmen paused. But David, I looked into her background. She's sharp. Former CFO of Whitmore Industries before her husband took over. The woman managed a $50 million annual budget. She's not some confused elderly widow Morrison can easily manipulate. That's what they all were before the disease took them. Smart, capable, successful women who would never have fallen for this under normal circumstances. I thought about my mother, brilliant and fierce and independent until Alzheimer's stole all of it. Morrison doesn't target stupid people. He targets people whose minds are betraying them. You think Whitmore has cognitive issues? I think Morrison wouldn't be circling if she didn't. That's his pattern. He waits until they start showing signs of decline. Then he moves in before family members notice what's happening. Then I'll be very careful how I warn her. Suggest she document any financial decisions she makes, involve her family in estate planning. Maybe get a second opinion from an independent attorney if anyone suggests changes to her will. That's good. That's exactly what she needs to hear. David. Carmen's voice changed, became more personal. How are you holding up? You've been going non-stop for 2 weeks. When's the last time you slept more than 4 hours? I looked around my home office. Walls covered with evidence, legal pads everywhere, coffee cups I'd forgotten to clean up. Sarah had stopped asking when I was coming to bed, just left blankets and pillows on the couch for when I inevitably passed out at 3 a.m. I'll sleep when we win, I said. That's what I'm afraid of. Promise me something. When this is over, when we've destroyed Morrison and recovered what he stole, promise me you'll take a vacation. Go somewhere without Wi-Fi, without cell service, without anything that reminds you of this case. I promise, assuming we win. We're going to win, David, because we're not fighting for money. We're fighting for our mothers, and that's stronger than any legal argument Patterson can make. I wanted to believe her, but I'd been a lawyer long enough to know that sometimes the righteous cause loses. Sometimes the predators win simply because they have better resources, more experienced attorneys, and a legal system that defaults to protecting property rights over protecting victims. But I couldn't let myself think that way. Not yet. Not while there was still a chance. 2 weeks until the dismissal hearing, I said. Let's make them count. The next 13 days were a blur of legal research, evidence compilation, and strategic planning. I wrote an opposition to Morrison's motion to dismiss that was 42 pages long and cited every case I could find, involving undue influence, diminished capacity, and elder abuse. Diana reviewed it and declared it thorough to the point of obsessive. That's the nicest thing anyone said to me in weeks, I replied. Carmen met with Margaret Whitmore and reported that the warning had been received carefully but noncommittally. She thanked me for sharing my mother's story, said she'd be cautious about her estate planning. Whether she actually takes the advice or whether Morrison has already convinced her I'm just a bitter daughter, I can't say. Detective Yates called twice. Once to report that Morrison had returned to the storage unit and spent 3 hours inside, and again to say that she'd finally convinced Judge Martinez to authorize surveillance cameras inside the facility. If he's destroying evidence, we'll have video proof, she said with satisfaction. And through it all, Richard Morrison remained in my mother's house, frozen financially by the restraining order, but otherwise untouched, living in the home she'd worked 40 years to buy, surrounded by the furniture she loved, probably sleeping in the bed she'd shared with my father. The thought made me physically ill. Friday arrived, the day of the dismissal hearing. I put on my best suit, packed a briefcase with enough evidence to bury Morrison twice over, and drove to Spokane with a knot of anxiety in my stomach. This was it, the moment when we'd learn whether this case would move forward or die before it ever reached trial. Judge Patricia Hendricks would decide whether Richard Morrison's 13-year crime spree would finally be exposed, or whether he'd walk away from my mother's death the same way he'd walked away from 5 others, free, wealthy, and already hunting his next victim. The Spokane County Courthouse looked exactly like every other government building I'd ever entered. Institutional, imposing, designed to make you feel small before the machinery of justice. I arrived at 8:30 a.m. for a 9 a.m. hearing. Briefcase, heavy with evidence, wearing the navy suit Sarah had insisted, made me look authoritative but sympathetic. Diana Reeves met me in the hallway outside Judge Hendrick's courtroom. "Carmen's here," she said, nodding toward a bench where Carmen sat in a black dress that looked appropriately somber. "She flew in last night. Wanted to be here when we argue this." "She didn't have to do that." "Yes, she did. This is her fight, too." Diana checked her watch. "Patterson will try to paint this as a simple estate dispute. Ungrateful son challenges legal transfers. We counter with pattern evidence, show that this isn't isolated, but systematic. The key is getting the judge to see Morrison as a predator, not a grieving widower." "What are our chances?" She gave me a look that was equal parts honesty and sympathy. 50-50, maybe 60-40 if the judge reads our brief carefully and understands the pattern. But David, dismissal hearings favor defendants. The legal standard is high. We have to show that even if everything Morrison claims is true, we still have a viable case. That's a tough bar. "So we could lose today." "We could lose today," she agreed. "But if we do, we appeal." This doesn't end here. The courtroom doors opened and people began filing in. I saw Richard Morrison immediately. Still distinguished looking at 70, silver hair perfectly styled, expensive suit that screamed old money and confidence. He walked with his attorney, James Patterson, the two of them laughing quietly about something, completely at ease. Like this was just another day, just another legal obstacle to overcome on his way to the next victim. Our eyes met across the courtroom. Richard's expression didn't change. No anger, no fear, just a slight smile that said he'd already won, and I was too stupid to know it yet. I smiled back, cold and humorless, and watched his confidence flicker just slightly. Good. Let him wonder what I knew. Let him spend this hearing worrying about what evidence I might have, what bombshells might be waiting. "All rise," the bailiff called. "The Spokane County Superior Court is now in session, the Honorable Judge Patricia Hendricks presiding." Judge Hendricks was exactly what I'd hoped for, based on her reputation. Mid-50s, former public defender who'd seen every type of fraud and manipulation, known for careful analysis and little patience for bullshit. She settled into her chair and looked down at the case file with an expression that suggested she'd already read every page. "Good morning, counsel. We're here on defendant's motion to dismiss in the matter of Chen and Mendoza-Wright versus Morrison. Mr. Patterson, this is your motion. You may proceed." James Patterson stood with practiced ease, every inch the experienced litigator who'd won hundreds of cases just like this one. "Thank you, Your Honor."
May it please the court, this case should be dismissed for three fundamental reasons. First, the statute of limitations has expired on the majority of plaintiffs' claims. Second, plaintiffs lack standing to challenge transfers made by competent adults who had every right to dispose of their property as they saw fit. And third, even taking plaintiffs' allegations as true, they fail to state a claim upon which relief can be granted. He clicked a remote and a PowerPoint presentation appeared on the courtroom screen. Professional, polished, devastating in its simplicity. Let's start with Margaret Chen Morrison. The property transfer occurred August 14th, 3 years ago. Bank account transfers occurred between 3 and 4 years ago. Washington's statute of limitations for fraud is 3 years. Even if plaintiffs could prove fraud, which they cannot, most of these claims are time-barred. Judge Hendricks made a note. What about the continuing violation doctrine? If Morrison engaged in an ongoing pattern of fraud, the statute wouldn't begin running until the last fraudulent act. The last act was Mrs. Morrison's death 2 weeks ago, Your Honor. But her death isn't a fraudulent act. It's a natural event. The allegedly fraudulent transfers all occurred years ago, and the clock started running then. Diana leaned over and whispered, "He's right about the statute issue. We need to pivot to the pattern evidence." Patterson continued, hitting his points with surgical precision. Second, the standing issue. David Chen is not a beneficiary of his mother's estate. Margaret Chen Morrison was married to Richard Morrison at the time of her death. Under Washington community property law, her spouse is the natural beneficiary. Mr.
Chen has no legal interest in challenging transfers his mother made during her lifetime. What about the claim of undue influence? Judge Hendricks asked. If the defendant exploited Mrs. Morrison's diminished capacity, wouldn't that give her son standing to challenge the transfers? Only if he can prove undue influence occurred, which requires showing that Mrs. Morrison lacked capacity at the time of the transfers. But, Your Honor, we have medical records. Patterson clicked to another slide showing a doctor's note from Margaret's primary physician stating that in August 3 years ago, she was oriented to person, place, and time, capable of making informed decisions about her care and finances. My stomach dropped. I hadn't seen that medical record before. Patterson had been holding it back, waiting for this moment. Diana was already scribbling notes furiously. That's dated August 10th, 4 days before the transfer. We can argue her condition fluctuated, that she had good days and bad days. Patterson wasn't done. Third, even if we ignore the statute of limitations and standing issues, plaintiff's complaint fails to state a valid claim. They allege a pattern of predatory behavior spanning 13 years. But, Your Honor, having relationships with multiple widows over the course of one's life is not illegal. Receiving gifts from friends is not illegal. Being named in someone's will is not illegal. He clicked through slides showing photos. Richard with Helen Patterson at a charity gala. Richard with Dorothy Simmons at the theater. Richard with my mother at their wedding. In every photo, the women looked happy, healthy, engaged. These were real relationships, Your Honor. Not schemes or conspiracies, but genuine friendships and companionship. The fact that these women chose to show their appreciation through financial gifts and estate provisions is their right. Mr. Chen and Ms. Mendoza-Wright may not like those choices, but their disapproval doesn't transform legal gifts into fraud. Judge Hendricks leaned forward slightly. What about the allegation that your client specifically targeted women with cognitive decline? The complaint alleges a pattern of befriending women shortly before or after dementia diagnoses. Correlation is not causation, Your Honor. My client has been active in Spokane's senior community for 15 years. He volunteers with several organizations that serve elderly residents. It's natural that many of his friends would be in that demographic, and statistically, many elderly people develop cognitive issues. Patterson's voice took on a tone of righteous indignation. Plaintiffs are essentially arguing that my client should have abandoned his friends the moment they showed signs of illness. That's not predatory behavior. The opposite would be predatory. I wanted to stand up, to shout that Patterson was twisting the facts, making Richard sound like a saint instead of the calculating predator he was. But this wasn't my moment to speak. Not yet. Patterson clicked to his final slide. Your Honor, the law is clear. Competent adults have the right to dispose of their property as they see fit. The fact that family members disagree with those choices or feel entitled to an inheritance they didn't receive is not grounds for a lawsuit. This case is exactly what it appears to be. Angry relatives who can't accept that they were left out of the will. He turned slightly, making eye contact with me for just a second. Mr. Chen and Ms. Mendoza-Wright have my sympathy. Losing a parent is difficult, and it's natural to feel anger when estates don't go as expected. But sympathy doesn't create a legal claim. I respectfully request that this court dismiss the complaint with prejudice and award costs to my client for having to defend against this meritless action. Patterson sat down, supremely confident. Richard patted him on the shoulder, a gesture of congratulation for a job well done. Judge Hendricks looked at Diana. Ms. Reeves, your response. Diana stood, and I could see the shift in her posture, from advisor to warrior. This was what she did best. Your Honor, Mr. Patterson has given this court a very polished presentation of alternative facts. But if you look past the PowerPoint and examine the actual evidence, you'll see something very different. You'll see a predator who has refined his system over 13 years, 5 victims, and nearly $2 million in stolen assets. She clicked her own remote. Our presentation appeared, less polished than Patterson's, but densely packed with evidence. Let's address the statute of limitations argument first. Yes, some of the asset transfers occurred more than 3 years ago. But, Your Honor, fraud based on concealment has a discovery rule. The statute doesn't begin running until the victim discovers or reasonably should have discovered the fraud. David Chen didn't discover the full extent of his mother's exploitation until after her death 2 weeks ago. At that point, he had 3 years to file suit, which he's done. Mrs. Morrison knew about the transfers when she signed the documents. Patterson interjected. She can't claim delayed discovery of something she participated in. Mrs. Morrison had Alzheimer's disease, Diana shot back. She couldn't discover fraud because she couldn't remember what happened from one day to the next. And that's exactly why Richard Morrison's conduct was so egregious. He exploited her inability to understand what was happening to her. Judge Hendricks held up a hand. Ms. Reeves, Mr. Patterson has medical records showing Mrs. Morrison was competent in August 3 years ago when she signed the property transfer. How do you respond to that? By pointing out that the record Mr. Patterson cited is from a routine office visit where the doctor spent approximately 15 minutes with Mrs. Morrison. That's not a cognitive capacity evaluation, Your Honor. That's a checkbox on a form. Diana clicked to a new slide. Margaret's actual medical history. But if we look at the full picture, we see something very different. The slide showed a timeline of my mother's medical appointments. June, 3 years ago. First notation of mild memory issues. July, 3 years ago. Referral to neurologist for cognitive testing. August 3rd, 3 years ago. Scheduled appointment with neurologist, never attended. August 10th, 3 years ago. Brief office visit, the one Patterson cited. August 14th, 3 years ago. Property transfer signed. September 3 years ago. Formal Alzheimer's diagnosis. Notice the gap, Your Honor. Mrs. Morrison was scheduled for cognitive testing on August 3rd, but never attended. The appointment was canceled by Richard Morrison, who told the neurologist's office that his wife was feeling better and didn't need testing after all. Then, 11 days later, she signed away her house. I saw Judge Hendricks's expression shift slightly, the first crack in Patterson's narrative. Diana pressed the advantage. Mr. Patterson wants you to believe this is about ungrateful children and legal gifts, but let's look at what actually happened here. Richard Morrison married Margaret Chen 7 years ago. Within 6 months, he convinced her to sell her business, the importing company she'd built over 30 years. Within a year, he'd transferred all of her investment accounts to joint ownership. Within 2 years, he'd moved all of her assets under his control. Click. A new slide showing the systematic asset transfers. And then, Your Honor, the exact same pattern with 4 other women. Helen Patterson, who died 11 years ago after transferring her house to Richard 2 years before her death. Dorothy Simmons, who died 9 years ago after giving Richard access to her bank accounts. Patricia Mendoza, who changed her will to leave Richard everything despite having a daughter. A will change that occurred 6 months before her death, while she had diagnosed dementia. Carmen stood up from her seat in the gallery. Judge Hendricks looked at her with interest. Your Honor, Diana said, this is Carmen Mendoza-Wright, daughter of Patricia Mendoza. She sued Mr. Morrison 7 years ago, alleging the exact same conduct David Chen is alleging now, that Morrison exploited her mother's cognitive decline to steal her estate. That case was settled, Patterson objected. It has no bearing on this proceeding. It has every bearing, Diana countered, because it establishes pattern and practice. Ms. Mendoza-Wright settled because she ran out of money to fight. But, Your Honor, if we allow this motion to dismiss, we're telling Richard Morrison that he can continue this pattern indefinitely. That, as long as he's careful with the paperwork, he can prey on vulnerable elderly women without consequences. Judge Hendricks looked directly at Carmen. Ms. Mendoza-Wright, your settlement agreement with Mr. Morrison, did it include a confidentiality provision? Carmen's voice was steady. Yes, Your Honor. I'm violating that NDA by being here today. Mr. Morrison's attorneys have already threatened me with legal action, but I don't care. Because if I stay silent, some other daughter will be standing where I'm standing in 5 years, and I'll know I could have stopped it. The courtroom was silent. I could see Richard whispering urgently to Patterson, his earlier confidence evaporating. Judge Hendricks made several notes, then looked up. Miss Reeves, even if I accept your patent evidence, and I'm not saying I do, you still have the fundamental problem of proving that these transfers were fraudulent rather than voluntary. Mr. Morrison was married to Margaret Chen. Married couples share assets. That's not exploitation. It's marriage. It is when the marriage itself was part of the fraud, Your Honor. Diana clicked to a new slide, one that made my heart race because I hadn't known she had this evidence. It was a timeline of Richard Morrison's marriages. Richard Morrison has been married 4 times in the last 15 years, Your Honor. Wife number 1, Helen Patterson, married for 18 months before her death, inherited her estate, valued at $620,000. Wife number 2, Dorothy Simmons, married for 14 months before her death, inherited her estate valued at $435,000. Wife number 3, died in a car accident unrelated to this case. And wife number 4, Margaret Chen Morrison, married for 8 years before her death, inherited her estate valued at $950,000. The courtroom erupted. Patterson was on his feet objecting. Richard's face had gone pale, and Judge Hendricks was banging her gavel for order. Your Honor, Diana continued over the noise, this isn't about a widower receiving his legal share of marital property.
This is about a man who has turned marriage into a business model. He targets wealthy widows, marries them, acquires their assets, and waits for them to die.
He's not a grieving spouse. He's a serial predator who's been doing this for over a decade. That is an outrageous accusation without any foundation, Patterson shouted. Your Honor, I move for sanctions against Ms. Reeves for making inflammatory statements, unsupported by evidence. I have evidence, Diana shot back. Marriage licenses, death certificates, property records, all publicly available. This isn't speculation. It's documented fact. Judge Hendricks held up both hands. Enough. Both of you approach the bench. Diana and Patterson walked forward. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I could see Patterson gesturing angrily, while Diana remained calm, pointing to documents in her file. After 3 minutes that felt like 3 hours, they returned to their seats. Judge Hendricks looked at the packed courtroom. More people had filtered in, drawn by the shouting. This hearing had become a spectacle. We're going to take a 15-minute recess, she said. When we return, I want to hear from Mr. Chen directly. I want to understand exactly what evidence he has to support these allegations beyond circumstantial patterns. She banged her gavel and left the bench. The courtroom immediately exploded into conversation. I felt Carmen's hand on my shoulder. Did you know about the other marriages? She asked. No. Diana must have found them in her research. I looked at Richard across the aisle. He was hunched over with Patterson, both of them speaking in urgent whispers. But it makes perfect sense. Helen Patterson wasn't just a victim. She was wife number 1. Dorothy Simmons was wife number 2. He's been marrying them, Carmen said slowly, not just befriending them, actually marrying them to get legal access to their estates. And my mother was number 4. The pattern was so clear now. Carmen, how did you not know he'd been married to your mother? He wasn't. My mother never married him. They were just companions. That's what made the lawsuit so hard, because he didn't have legal spousal rights. He had to rely on the will change and the gifts she'd given him. She looked at Richard with pure hatred. He learned from my mother's case. He realized marriage was cleaner, gave him automatic legal rights without having to prove the relationship. Diana returned to our table, looking energized. The judge is interested, very interested. She asked me in chambers if I had any direct evidence of Morrison's knowledge of Margaret's incapacity. My hand went to my briefcase where I'd stored copies of the photos from Richard's filing cabinet. The photos I'd taken illegally that couldn't be admitted into evidence without destroying my own case. Unless… Diana, what if I testified that I saw documents in Richard's house? Would that be admissible? You'd be admitting to criminal trespass. My mother gave me a key to that house 15 years ago. I used that key to enter what was at the time my mother's property. If I happened to see documents while I was there, that's a very thin line you're walking. But would it be admissible? She thought for a moment. Potentially. If you testify that you used a key your mother gave you, entered the house in good faith to retrieve personal items after her death, and happened to observe documents in plain view. Yes, that testimony would be admissible. The documents themselves wouldn't be, but your testimony about what you saw would be. Then that's what I'll do. David, Diana's voice was serious, if you do this, Patterson will crucify you on cross-examination. He'll make you look like a burglar, a liar, someone who broke into his client's house to steal evidence. It could backfire spectacularly. Or it could win us this hearing. Sarah appeared at my elbow. She'd been sitting in the back row, watching everything. David, are you sure about this? Once you testify, you can't take it back. I looked at Richard Morrison, still whispering with his attorney, still confident that his money and his lawyers would protect him, like they had protected him for 13 years. I'm sure, I said. Let's end this. When court reconvened, Judge Hendricks looked directly at me. Mr. Chen, please take the stand. I want to hear from you directly about the evidence supporting your allegations. I walked to the witness box, was sworn in, and sat down facing the courtroom. Richard was staring at me with naked hostility now, all pretense of dignified widower gone. Diana approached with a gentle expression. We'd practiced this in the hallway during recess, the careful dance of question and answer that would get my testimony on record, without triggering evidentiary objections. Mr. Chen, when did you first become aware of the transfers your mother made to Richard Morrison? After her death, when Mr. Morrison informed me that he owned her house and all of her financial assets. That must have been shocking. It was. My mother had always told me the house would be mine someday. It had been in our family for 40 years. Did you attempt to verify Mr. Morrison's claims? Yes. I requested copies of the property deed and found that ownership had been transferred to him 3 years ago, shortly after my mother's Alzheimer's diagnosis. And what did you do next? This was it, the moment where I either won the case or destroyed my credibility forever. I went to my mother's house, the house where I grew up, where my mother had lived for 40 years. I still had the key she'd given me when I was in high school. I wanted to retrieve some personal items, family photos, things that had sentimental value. And, did you enter the house? Yes, the key still worked. I let myself in. Patterson was on his feet. Objection, Your Honor. Mr. Chen just admitted to criminal trespass. Any evidence he obtained through that illegal entry should be excluded. Judge Hendricks looked at me. Mr. Chen, when you entered the house, did you know it was no longer your mother's property? I chose my words carefully. I knew that Mr. Morrison claimed ownership, but I also knew that the property had belonged to my mother for 4 decades, that she had given me a key and permission to access the house at any time. I believed I had a right to be there to collect family belongings. Continue, Ms. Reeves. Diana nodded. Mr. Chen, what did you see when you entered the house? Everything had changed. My mother's furniture was gone, replaced with new pieces. Family photos had been removed. It was like she'd been erased from her own home. I felt the anger rising and let it show. But in what used to be my father's office, I found something that hadn't been changed. What was that? A filing cabinet. It was unlocked, and I could see file folders with names on them. I recognized one of the names, Helen Patterson. I'd seen that name in property records as another woman Mr. Morrison had acquired assets from. Patterson was objecting again, but Judge Hendricks waved him off. "I'll allow it. Continue." I looked inside the filing cabinet and found files on 5 women: Helen Patterson, Dorothy Simmons, Patricia Mendoza, Evelyn Hart, and my mother, Margaret Chen. Each file contained documentation of asset transfers, property deeds, bank account information. "Did you see anything else in these files?" "Yes. There were handwritten notes. One of them, dated August 10th, 3 years ago, 4 days before my mother signed over her house, said, "M showing increased confusion. Dr. Patterson confirms cognitive decline accelerating. Optimal window for legal transfers closing. Moved timeline up from December to August." The courtroom went completely silent. "Mr. Morrison wrote that?" Diana asked. "It was in his handwriting, in his personal files, in a document that proved he knew my mother's cognitive ability was declining and that he was deliberately moving quickly to get her to sign documents before she became incompetent." "Objection!" Patterson was shouting now. "This is hearsay. Improper foundation. Chain of custody issues." "Your Honor," Diana interrupted calmly, "this is not being offered for the truth of the matter asserted. It's being offered to show Mr. Morrison's knowledge and state of mind. Mr. Chen is testifying about what he personally observed in documents that were in plain view in a house he had permission to enter." Judge Hendricks was writing furiously. "I'm going to allow the testimony for now, subject to later authentication issues. Mr. Patterson, you'll have your chance on cross-examination. Continue, Ms. Reeves." "Mr. Chen, were there other documents in these files?" "Yes. Photo albums with pictures of Mr. Morrison with each of the 5 women, spanning years. Bank records showing systematic withdrawals from their accounts. Property transfer documents. It was like he'd kept a complete record of every asset he'd taken from each victim. Why would someone keep such detailed records of criminal activity?" I looked directly at Richard. "Because he didn't think it was criminal. He thought it was smart business. He'd been doing it successfully for 13 years and no one had ever stopped him. He kept records the way any business keeps records, to track his assets, manage his targets, ensure he didn't miss any opportunities." Richard's face had gone from pale to red. He was whispering urgently to Patterson, but Patterson was focused on his notepad, already preparing for cross-examination. "One final question, Mr. Chen. Why are you pursuing this case? What do you hope to achieve?" I took a breath. "I don't care about the money, Your Honor. I know that sounds convenient to say, but it's true. I have a good job. My wife and I are financially stable. What I care about is justice for my mother and the 4 other women Richard Morrison exploited. I care about stopping him from doing this to victim number 6. "Victim number 6, Judge Hendricks asked. "Margaret Whitmore, Your Honor. She's a 75-year-old widow with an $8 million estate. Mr. Morrison has been courting her for the past 6 months. He's following the exact same pattern, attending social events with her, positioning himself as her companion, gradually working his way into her life. If we don't stop him now, she'll be the next woman whose family discovers too late that everything is gone." Diana returned to her seat. "No further questions, Your Honor." Judge Hendricks looked at Patterson. "Cross-examination." Patterson stood slowly, and I could see the calculation in his eyes. He needed to destroy my credibility without making himself look like he was bullying a grieving son. "Mr. Chen, you testified that you had permission to enter the house on Maple Street. Who gave you that permission?" "My mother, 15 years ago when she gave me a key." 15 years ago? before she married Richard Morrison. Before the property was legally transferred to his name. Patterson's voice was sharp. Did you ask Mr. Morrison's permission to enter his house? No. Did you inform him you were entering? No. So, you broke into his house without permission, opened his private filing cabinets, photographed his personal documents, and you want this court to believe that was legal. I didn't break in.
I used a key I had legal possession of to enter a house that should still belong to my mother. But doesn't belong to your mother. Belongs to my client.
Legally, properly, as documented by a deed that was recorded 3 years ago. Patterson moved closer. Mr. Chen, isn't it true that you're so desperate to invalidate your mother's legal transfers that you committed burglary to find evidence? Objection, Diana called. Argumentative and assumes facts, not an evidence. Sustained, Judge Hendricks said. Rephrase, Mr. Patterson. Mr. Chen, you admit you entered my client's house without permission and looked through his private files. Correct? I entered my mother's house and found evidence of systematic fraud. Evidence you stole. Evidence I photographed and left in place. Patterson's smile was predatory. And where are these photographs now? If you have such damning evidence, why haven't you produced it in discovery? This was the trap. If I admitted I had the photos, Patterson would move to exclude them. If I claimed I didn't have them, he'd argue my testimony was fabricated. Encore, I provided information about the existence of those documents to law enforcement. I said carefully. Detective Sarah Yates with Spokane PD is investigating based on that information. So you went to the police and said, I broke into someone's house and found evidence of a crime. And they took you seriously? I informed them that based on my knowledge of Mr. Morrison's pattern of behavior, I believed evidence of elder abuse existed and could be found in his residence. Whether or not they choose to investigate is their decision. Patterson changed tactics. Mr. Chen, you testified that you don't care about money. But isn't it true that if this court invalidates the transfers to my client, you stand to inherit nearly $1 million? If the transfers are invalidated, my mother's estate would be distributed according to her will from before she developed Alzheimer's. Yes, I'm a beneficiary, but that's not why I'm here. No. Then why didn't you visit your mother more often when she was alive? Why did you leave her care to my client while you pursued your career in Seattle? The guilt hit like a punch to the stomach. I'd been waiting for this attack, but it still hurt. I visited my mother every Sunday for 3 years, a 5-hour drive each way, every single week. Once a week, Patterson repeated, while my client visited every day. Every single day for 3 years, Mr. Chen. Who was really there for your mother? The son who showed up once a week, or the husband who dedicated his life to her care? The husband who was systematically stealing from her while she forgot her own name? Or the husband who loved her and supported her while her son was too busy to visit more than once a week? Patterson turned to the judge. Your Honor, this entire case is based on a son's guilt and jealousy. He feels bad that he wasn't there for his mother, so he's invented this conspiracy theory to justify his absence and his greed. Every document he claims to have seen is inadmissible. Every transfer he wants to invalidate was legal and proper. This is exactly what I said in my opening. An ungrateful child who can't accept that his mother made choices he doesn't approve of. He sat down, satisfied he'd landed his blows. Judge Hendricks looked at me. Mr. Chen, do you have anything to add? I thought about my mother in those last days, confused, frightened, not knowing where she was or who I was. I thought about Richard Morrison visiting her every day, not out of love but out of calculated self-interest, making sure his investment was secure. Your Honor, my mother was brilliant. She built a business from nothing, raised me alone after my father died, worked 2 jobs to give me opportunities she never had. She deserved better than to spend her final years being robbed by someone she trusted. I looked at Richard. I wasn't there as much as I should have been. I'll live with that guilt for the rest of my life. But that doesn't make what he did right. It doesn't make it legal, and it doesn't mean he should be allowed to do it again to Margaret Whitmore or whoever comes after her. Judge Hendricks was silent for a long moment, then looked at both attorneys. I'm going to take this under advisement. This is too important a decision to make from the bench without careful consideration of all the evidence and arguments presented today. I'll issue a written ruling within 2 weeks. Your Honor, Patterson objected. Respectfully, this is a straightforward motion to dismiss. The law is clear. The law may be clear to you, Mr. Patterson, but I have some concerns about the pattern evidence presented by Ms. Reeves. I want to review the case law carefully before ruling. She looked at me, then at Richard. 2 weeks. Court is adjourned. The gavel came down. Outside the courtroom, Diana pulled me aside while Carmen and Sarah waited nearby. That was risky, she said, testifying about evidence you obtained through questionable means. Patterson landed some good shots about the burglary. But the judge didn't dismiss it. She's taking it under advisement, which means she's interested, very interested. Diana checked her phone. I'm getting a call from Detective Yates. 1 second. She stepped away to take the call. I walked over to Carmen and Sarah, who both hugged me simultaneously. You were amazing, Sarah said. When you talked about your mother's brilliance, I saw people in the gallery crying. Patterson made me look like a jealous burglar. He made you look human, Carmen corrected. Someone who loved his mother and made mistakes but is trying to do the right thing now. That's what the judge will remember. Diana returned, her expression unreadable. That was Detective Yates. She's been monitoring the storage unit where Morrison has been spending time. He went there this morning before the hearing, stayed for 90 minutes, and left with his arms full of boxes. My stomach dropped. He's destroying evidence, or moving it. Either way, Yates has enough for her warrant now. She's getting Judge Martinez to sign it this afternoon. By tonight, Spokane PD will be executing search warrants on both Morrison's house and the storage unit. What does that mean for our case? It means if they find what you say is there, the filing cabinet, the notes, the photo albums, it becomes part of a criminal investigation. We can reference it in our civil case, argue that Morrison is under criminal investigation for the same conduct we're alleging. That's huge for us, David. Hope flared in my chest. And if they don't find anything, if he's already destroyed it all, then we fight with what we have. The pattern evidence, Carmen's testimony, your observations from when you entered the house. Diana squeezed my shoulder. But my guess, Morrison's arrogant. He's been getting away with this for 13 years. He thinks he's untouchable. He probably didn't destroy the evidence. He just moved it somewhere he thinks is safer. Across the courthouse steps, I saw Richard Morrison and James Patterson emerging. Richard was on his phone, speaking urgently. Patterson looked grim. They knew. They knew the warrant was coming. Richard's eyes met mine across the distance. This time, he wasn't smiling. This time, he looked like a man who'd just realized that maybe, possibly, his perfect system had a fatal flaw. Me. Carmen stepped up beside me. What happens now? Now we wait, I said. 2 weeks for the judge's ruling. Tonight for the search warrant execution. And somewhere in that time, we find out if justice actually exists or if monsters like Richard Morrison really are untouchable. My money's on justice, Sarah said quietly. I wanted to believe her, but I'd been a lawyer long enough to know that sometimes the monsters win, sometimes the system fails, sometimes predators get away with it because they're smarter, richer, more patient than the people trying to stop them. But not this time. This time I wasn't going to stop until Richard Morrison paid for every dollar he'd stolen, every life he'd destroyed, every woman he'd exploited. This time, the monster was going down. That night at 8:47 p.m., I got the call from Detective Yates. We executed the warrant. Both locations, the house and the storage unit. My heart was pounding. And you were right. The filing cabinet was exactly where you said it would be. In the study. 5 files, 5 victims, documentation going back 13 years. Photo albums, handwritten notes, bank records. David, it's a prosecutor's dream. Everything we need to prove systematic elder abuse, fraud, and financial exploitation. I closed my eyes, feeling something break loose in my chest. Tension I'd been carrying since my mother died. What about the storage unit? That's where it gets interesting. Morrison had more files there. 6 more, actually. Women we didn't even know about. He's been doing this longer than we thought, David. Longer and more systematically. 6 more. 11 victims total. Oh my God. The district attorney is reviewing everything tonight. Based on what we found, we're looking at multiple counts of theft, fraud, forgery, and elder abuse. Morrison will be arrested within 48 hours. Will he get bail? Probably. Flight risk arguments will be tough. He's 70, lived in Spokane his whole life, has ties to the community. Judge will likely set high bail, but grant it. She paused. But David, even if he makes bail, his life as he knows it is over. The evidence we seized will be public record. The media will have a field day. And every family he's ever stolen from will finally have proof of what he did. Thank you, I said, my voice breaking. Thank you for believing me, for investigating, for doing what the system should have done years ago. Thank you for being stubborn enough to fight when everyone else settled or gave up. You saved lives today, David. Margaret Whitmore, whoever Morrison was planning to target next, they're safe now because you didn't stop. After we hung up, I sat in my home office, surrounded by evidence that was no longer needed, looking at my mother's photo on the desk. We got him, Mom, I whispered. He's not getting away with it this time. My phone buzzed with a text from Carmen. Yates just called me. We did it. We actually did it. Then Diana. DA's office wants to meet with us Monday. Criminal charges incoming. You were right about everything. And finally, Sarah from the next room. David, come to bed. You've been fighting for 2 weeks straight. Let yourself rest. But I couldn't rest. Not yet. Because in 2 weeks, Judge Hendricks would rule on the motion to dismiss. And yes, we had the criminal investigation now. Yes, Richard Morrison was about to be arrested. But none of that mattered if the judge threw out our civil case. None of it mattered if we couldn't recover the assets he'd stolen and return them to the families he'd destroyed. So I went back to my legal pads, my case law research, my preparation for whatever came next. Because this wasn't over. It was just beginning.